This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
It's Paul Verschure with the Convergent Science Network podcast here at our Barcelona Cognition Brain Technology Summer School 2018, together with my colleague Tony Prescott. And we have Lars Muckli here. And Lars, welcome to the podcast. So Lars, you spoke about internal models and counterfactual cognition predicting our environment. And as the title might suggest, prediction was very much at the center of your presentation. So why do you believe that prediction gives us sort of this strategic lever to understand how the brain works?
I think a few years back, I kind of tried to conceptualize everything I know so far from visual processing, let's say 10 years ago. And I thought that at some point we have a generally accepted narrative of a visual hierarchy that goes of increasing features represented, for example, in the visual system. And in this story, I felt that there is a particular capability missing. If, let's say, we are driving around in a car and this would be for our brains in this conventional narrative kind of an overdrive. There's lots of varying stimuli. There's lots of signal that needs to be attended to, that are competing for attention. It is integrated, bound together, these complex features, and yet it is possible to effortlessly navigate around and have thoughts about your holiday, about your next research grant, about complicated conceptual theories and thoughts. And so I thought if we use the kind of narrative that is coming out of describing early visual cortex and then higher stages of visual cortex as the template of how the entire brain works, we have a very busy and buzzing neuronal system, which is combining features, and we run out of brain space before we have an explanation of those really exciting things that we are doing. So I thought something isn't quite right. And I think predictive processing framework brings to the table a narrative that is refreshingly different by saying, well, it makes sense if you do something like driving in the car, where lots of those features, even though they are quite complex, and even though they have spatial, temporal dynamics that from a bottom-up system is complicated, you can see that a hierarchical system is well equipped to explain that away, to focus on only the surprising light that comes up and signals that you're out of petrol, and ignore the commercials that are running by and these kind of things, because lots of that can be explained away by different precision explanations. You're expecting something to fly by, you're expecting commercials to try to attract your attention, and you ignore it. So I think there's a lot that can be brought to the table by this top-down, by this global narrative.
So that feels also a bit an idea of how do you, let's say, optimize information processing by actually just looking at your errors. So that means the stuff you didn't expect, as opposed to stuff you expect.
Yeah.
And but was there also something in the data that you were working with at the time that was suggestive of moving in that direction? Was there sort of a parsimony in the data that you felt needed to be explained in those terms?
Yeah. So 10 years ago, we have worked in principle with very simple stimuli that looked at apparent motion, which is from one perspective maybe the most simple visual illusion you can think of, because it only requires 2 dots that blink in a certain spatial temporal pattern so that your visual system combines them to the illusion of a continuous movement from this one location to the other location. And if it's long distance, it may appear as one jump, but it's still one object. And commercials work with this. You see this all around. It's, everywhere. But it's a very simple illusion that we looked at and that we used to show how the visual system integrates this information and feeds back to early visual cortex. So that was an early finding. And let's say I started with a surprising finding of some feedback in the intermediate space between these dots, which induce their pair motion, but which is then filled by some activity, and we tried to make sense of this activity. So it was actually driven by an experimental result from fMRI that this intermediate space was filled with activity, that we then thought of how to explain that, which then brought us to several competing hypotheses. One was related to consciousness and representing of an item, and the other was more related to predictive coding framework, which we then followed up with several experiments, which we then came up with a sampling strategy to test predictive processing, which led us to the conclusion that there is a predictive model that is projected down to early visual cortex. And that's how we started. And the story I told you about, 10 or 12 years ago or so, was when I then left Frankfurt and went to Glasgow, and I was thinking of new grand ideas that I put in grand applications. And coming from this very simple stimulus, I wanted to make it more realistic, using more realistic complex stimuli, and using also more interactive subjects. So we created one extrapolation was including eye movements, another one was using complex stimuli and looking for predictive processes with these more complex scenes.
Yeah, so I'm interested in how and why you arrived at the idea of using apparent motion as the paradigm. I mean, you as you say, you're motivated by this predictive framework, and you began by describing some ideas from people like David Mumford and his active blackboard idea that there is a sort of representation of what you expect to see in the world in higher brain areas. And you also described a study from Hansen et al., which talked about if we're watching snippets from a Hollywood movie, we build up this picture in our heads in the higher areas of the visual pathway of the meaning of the story and so on. And that this feeds back and influences processing in the lower visual areas. So, but the task you choose to focus on, apparent motion, is of course very well known in psychology from centuries back. It was the Gestalt psychologists found this and focused on it and really talked about it as a way of thinking about, well, without perhaps too much theoretical insight into it, but seeing it such a dynamical process that's happening in the brain. Not so much necessarily a hierarchical process, though. So it is a bit of a leap to go from a Gestalt process like apparent motion to a hypothesis about hierarchy.
Okay. Interestingly, I think when we started brain imaging, and that goes back to 1996, when I joined Rainer Goebel's lab, apparent motion and other Gestalt laws were kind of the first start of how we wanted to look into the human brain to see where these Gestalt laws are represented. And motion was something that we started with. Actually, the second experiment was imagery of motion, and we're surprised to see that worked and activated V5. And why we did these apparent motion experiments one was about bistable apparent motion, and the switches between perceiving the motion content and not perceiving the motion content was something that you can follow in the activity of V5. But then we found something in the data that actually V1 knows something about, gets informed about some of those integration processes. And it was with Nico Krieger's squad at that time that we were late at night discussing what could be the kind of feedback, the tray along a trace in the apparent motion, how that could be informative. And we came then to David Mumford's kind of seminal papers of the 90s, in which he motivated this active blackboard theory, not totally being explicit whether this active blackboard is a subcortical thalamic structure or primary visual cortex, but the idea that these expert areas kind of converge to their best guesses in a scene and scribble this onto a blackboard to kind of negotiate the scene and the surprises within the scene and so on was quite attractive. And we thought, okay, how can we test this? And I think that started the following experiments. And apparent motion is good in the sense that you can have the inducing stimuli far away from a region in the middle where you have the illusion. And since the early part of my brain imaging, I always use retrotopic mapping, and the trick that the spatial separation of components can be done very cleanly in fMRI, maybe better than in some other methods. So in EEG, you always have everything together. You have a better temporal resolution, but the signal can be separated so well. And in fMRI, one of the advantages, you can do individual maps and then get the single signals out of those retrotopic components. And I think it's this tool that I wanted to explore and use more and more over the years, up to our most recent finding, where we can see that in more complex scenes, this occluded part or retrotopic space can show that you have something like a mental map or mental hypothesis drawn out.
I think one of the interesting issues here is, and that came out in the talk, was how much of the kinds of constraints that the brain is using to do something like apparent motion tasks are going to be implemented within a level of the hierarchy, and how many of them are going to be, higher levels of the hierarchy. So, I think most of your talk was about how the upper levels might influence the process in the lower levels, but you presumably would also recognize that there are some processes happening within V1 itself, which are going to do things like Gestalt properties, or will encourage sort of things like completion and things.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting feature of using apparent motion, that because the apparent motion, the motion that we trigger is a very fast one and a long distance one. So it's 12 degrees visual angle. It goes to 60 degrees per second. Those are features that V1 cannot process, and higher visual areas like V5, if it's considered to be higher, but specialized visual access striate areas are specialized to process tuning along these motion energies, high speed, long distances. And so it's a particular good case in which we can look into V1's typical feed-forward features and see the addition of complex features that aren't typical to V1. If you want to say in a different way, V1 has a certain language to speak.
Yeah.
And we kind of test the multilinguality of V1 because other areas speak in a different language. And the question is, some of the interesting and still not totally resolved question is are these areas translating to V1? So that is V5 translating its prediction and explaining to V1 in a spatial localized way at a very high speed? You expect a dot to see here, 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 and this orientation? Or is it more of a kind of a envelope translation to say there's high energy motion in this part of the visual field, but your knowledge about the concrete incidence, orientation, and so on will combine to a better understanding of the situation? And that's, I think, the kind of model that I have in my mind. There isn't a full translation. I touched upon this with mapping the precision of the filling in complex scenes. There's a line drawings but the precision is around 4 degrees. V1 has a precision of 1 degree. So it's more like saying there's a line somewhere around here, or there's a motion of that kind of speed somewhere around here. And this is what top-down can give as a prediction, and combined with the lateral information, saying, oh, there was a dot that just disappeared here, together with the energy prediction up there, I can now make a very precise prediction by combining those two constraints.
But before we get there, because that's sort of after a number of experiments, right?
Right.
And I think that the first question is whether, given the data you have on this apparent motion paradigm, whether this predictive mind hypothesis, or the active inference hypothesis, however you want to call it, is the most parsimonious explanation of the data that you have. Because what you showed in your first experiment is that apparent motion. So we have the two fields are being stimulated in a certain order. So you have this idea there's something moving, right? And now you're going to flash a stimulus in the center area, either synchronized with this apparent motion, right? Or out of sync, out of phase with this apparent motion, where you look at the time difference of one frame, right? So this would be about 15 milliseconds or something like this. So it's a very slight deviation, right, of the predicted path. And then what you do observe in your fMRI is that 8 seconds after stimulation, either congruent or incongruent, you see a slight deflection or deviation of the bolt response in the area that you stimulated with this predicted or unpredicted stimulus, which is slightly higher. So the bolt response is slightly higher for the deviant stimulus as compared to the congruent stimulus. Right? This is the main effect. And the deviation, the bolt signal, is of the order of about 8 to 10%, something like this, right? And it's also slightly enhanced in both cases relative to the baseline response, right? So now, why do you believe that this predictive coding hypothesis interpretation is the most parsimonious explanation of the data itself, right?
Andy Clark has a wonderful cover picture in his book on predictive processing, I think, or it's called differently. It's Surfing Uncertainty. And if you take the picture, we are in Barcelona. I've seen the beach this morning. It's the model is a little bit like this. You have this wave of motion energy of prediction. It is translated to something that needs energy in V1, like a prediction, and then you place on this wave a surfer that surfs the waves and then is efficient and comes through and is detected. That's the dot that's in time. And the surfer that has a little bit of a timing problem won't make this and will fall off the wave. And that's the prediction error. And that makes a small difference. And the surprising result is that this one frame difference is detectable in both signal. And my most parsimonious explanation, the way I think, is, you see at this moment the mismatch between the prediction and the surfer, that the dot that doesn't quite make it to be within this envelope. Now, as I said earlier, this envelope moves very fast, 60 degrees visual angle. That's faster than any motion detector on V1. V1 has lots of lateral connections, but I doubt that they have the speed to process this. But I'm not opposed to this explanation. I've had several discussions. People are on both sides saying, well, it could be, there could be a contribution. And in the model that I just pictured before, I do think there is a contribution of lateral interaction, given the feedback signal of a certain motion envelope and giving the neighborhood relation of the just disappearing dot gives the high precision of this. How I would say
the long range lateral interactions in the V1 are iso orientation, right? So neurons that like similar features link together over long distances, and that would of course be a perfect substrate to exploit to get apparent motion, because the activity will be very actively guided along neurons with a similar response tuning to move in a certain direction, right? So this would give you essentially a kind of entrainment response, right, to explain apparent motion, which might be also more in line with actually the Gestalt ideas, right? So, can you
for this model, just that's why I like to use the image of the paper of Mock. I'm blanking on her name, but who did the apparent motion with the gratings, and the filling in is inducing a new feature, which is a new orientation, which is not just neighborhood relation, it's a smooth transition. Now, maybe the case can be made that the lateral interaction smoothly goes from one orientation over space to bleeds into other orientation. But it's not such that the feature that's picked up on the apparent motion trace is a just replication of the neighboring feature in orientation. So it to me, it looks more as a constructed feature.
But that would just be a matter, as long as I take enough freedom to fiddle with the topography of the lateral interactions, I could also get this apparent feature, right? But another answer, of course, could be that you could still say, look, you see, we agree, because the predictive model still holds. It's just that the substrate is also included already in V1 wiring. But for some reason in your view, you want to see it like a hierarchical system, right? And without ascribing a big functional role to the local structure of V1 in this case. Well, you also know that 98% of the synapses in the V1 volume originate inside V1. Only a tiny fraction comes from outside V1, right? So do you believe that this tiny fraction of long-range projections coming out of V2 or out of your thalamus, right, or other cortical areas are sufficient to carry your predictive model?
So there are two lines of evidence where we really looked at this interaction. One that I presented, one that I didn't present. Maybe to add the one that I didn't present, we used an EEG experiment, again with the apparent motion design. And we found two components that have energy, motion energy components as compared to flicker. And those components were around 100 milliseconds and around 140 milliseconds after stimulus onset. And we then had the question, which one is from retinotopic regions and which one is from V5? And what we found is we applied the apparent motion in the upper visual field and in the lower visual field, which induces an EEG component in the dorsal and in the ventral stream. So they have different orientation. and we subtracted one where we had apparent motion in the upper visual field from in the lower visual field, and found that the early component was subtracted away, meaning that the motion sensitive area V5, which in both cases has the same localization, is the early one, around 100 milliseconds, and the later one, the 140, is the upper and the lower of the retrotopic. So the retrotopic component comes 40 milliseconds later. So the other experiment I showed was the TMS experiment, at which we stimulate V5 50 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds before the onset of the flicker, which is on the apparent motion trace. And this TMS takes away the predictability effect on the apparent motion trace. So both of those indicators, I think, speak more to a communication between V5, which is tuned to process this high velocity motion across huge space, and the more localized features in V1. And so therefore I think it's a good paradigm, because different features are processed in different regions, and they are naturally optimized for this, and you can see this kind of interaction.
But now it's an alternative for the two experiments. I could also argue, look, see, your first experiment, you show V5 leading V1 in this response, correct? And then I could argue, well, but maybe you need a minimum volume of response to actually be detectable with your methods of fMRI. This kind of, given the having convergence to V1, you will only get that initial critical response that is detectable at the V5 level and after the V1. So it's more an artifact of your measurement technique than really reflecting the underlying dynamics. Can you exclude that?
So it's true that we usually have these block designs, but in the EEG experiment, we measure, these short. I mean, this 100 milliseconds after onset of the apparent motion energy component as compared to blinking, for example. And also in our experiment where we combine apparent motion with saccades, it's such that it even works after the saccade in the new hemisphere, which, if I understand you correctly, you're saying you need repetition over time to build up the V5 signal.
Well, just convergence, it's plain convergence, right? That you just have a sufficient drive onto that volume of cells to become really a clean signal that you can extract with your method, as opposed to a more distributed, diffuse signal in V1 that is more difficult to detect.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you like, if you take V1 after the saccade, a blinking dot, so there's the inducer, the last stimulus of the apparent motion, and a blinking dot next to it, the target. Those two are always perfect apparent motion. If that would be the only event, if V1 in the new hemisphere would process that on its own, they are as much related to one another. The in time is as much related as the out of time. The only thing that makes these two stimulation conditions different is the history that was processed in V5 and in V1 in the other hemisphere. So it's bringing this history to this new situation that makes that creates a difference. It might be true that it needs to build up over time, this hypothesis in V5, because apparent motion is a peculiar situation. If you have just two dots and you perceive them as apparent motion, there's no other way describing that as post-diction. You have after the second event only, you can understand that it was a motion, and every point in between would be integrated at a later time point. So it's like you're reversing the time frame. We in our experiments, we have always had 8 iterations of apparent motion. So that takes care, the visual system kind of has time to catch up with the delay in stimulation to then run in time. If the famous experiment is if you do in a pair motion, you take away one stimulus, so it's repetitive, and then you take a stimulus away, you will still continue to see a pair motion because your visual system is now so predictive that it fills in this, that it can catch up. It needs to do post-diction of the missing stimulus to realize.
So your pair motion is there, but the question is, do we really see a strong contribution to the phenomenon at the signal level of something we might want to call a predictive model, right? So then also for your second example, you could also see where you talk about your TMS experiment. Say, look, if I zap V5, I can sort of disrupt the error detection signal. This is how you would interpret it, right? And then the error detection signal or the deviant triggered signal ends up roughly the same magnitude as the congruent stimulus, right? But that's, of course, I could still argue, but that's at best a necessary condition of a predictive model, and it doesn't prove in any way that what comes from V5 is a predictive model that is processed into an error at the V1 level, right? Can you exclude that?
What I'm struggling to find a way in which we could prove that. Your distinction, how so which aspect are you questioning the content of the model? So to say, V5 speaks to V1,
and we don't debate, right? We accept.
Okay,
yeah.
And the content of the message has something to do with the apparent motion, and are you now saying there could also be a contribution of lateral interaction in V1 that contributes to creation of this complex prediction that we test?
Right. Well, yeah. I think so. This is an alternative explanation that so far you couldn't exclude yet.
No, I'm not.
Except that you're saying, well, but I have a TMS experiment, and then I'm saying, yeah, but wait, I could still have all this process playing out at the V1 level. We know anatomically V5 projects back to V1. So if I zap V5, it's not so strange. Something happens at the V1 level, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether this is a prediction being fed back or just there's anatomical connection between the two areas and a signal exchange.
So I think Jeff Hawkins uses this kind of explanation of this hierarchical predictive memory prediction framework, in which it says, you at every level, the neuronal microunit is trying to explain its own activity given the surrounding stimulus history in the context of a message from a higher level top-down prediction. So, and the example he's using is like if you have a melody, then the higher up areas in auditory cortex would tell you what is expected to continue in this melody, and giving the local information of transients at this lower level, and giving the envelope context from higher, you create these neurons kind of create what's most likely to happen next. And so it's within this kind of model that I would also, and there's actually a good model that does that for apparent motion or for motion behind occluders, where it does exactly this, that the top-down is the kind of envelope and the lateral is the additional information that then converges to a precise prediction. So the example here being you have a motion of a certain energy disappearing into behind a occluder, and the way it's modeled is there's a motion energy expected in this area, but you can't be very precise where it is. The disappearance of the dot gives an additional constraint, and these two information together make a very precise prediction of the trajectory of the dot. And that's the way I think about it. So I'm not excluding the lateral interaction.
So you're saying then the idea of a hierarchical predictive model is a functional concept that's not mimicked or in sort of an isotropic way mapped to the anatomical hierarchy, because it might be implemented by some, let's say, confluence of recurrent projections and local interactions in neural circuits.
Exactly.
This will be your point.
Yes.
Okay. All clear. Because also in that sense, you made the point, and also it resonates with this, is that, look, the traditional view, and that's also where Hawkins, I think, sits, would be rather dogmatic in that sense, right? There's a top-down prediction, and this comes together at a lower level in the hierarchy where it leads to an error, right? There's a real comparison taking place between the state that this lower level area believes is correct. It gets a reference, if you want, from a top-down area, and now a comparison happens and I have an error, right? And your data would not really reflect that in such a literal sense, right? Because and essentially in what you'll see, a bold signal for the matching, the congruent stimulus also leads to a deflection of the signal, as does the incongruent stimulus, although the deflection is somewhat different, right? So that means it's not about the error processing, apparently. So what do you then think is being processed, is being generated in that local V1 circuit if it's not an error as the traditional models would predict?
Well, I think this is, of course, a very good point, but it seems like a point about the labels we add to those coding differences, right? So if a prediction is violated and the violation of the prediction gives a different signal, or whether it's a confirmation of a prediction that gives another signal, it is the combination of input signal and expectations that are combined, and they can be subtracted, which is the prediction of the predictive coding proper way, or it could be multiplicated and resonate. And it's very difficult to define the level at which we can resolve that debate, because so I'm currently not sure how we would resolve this, because at the neuronal level, so what is the right level of description? We have the microcircuitry within V1 that is a combination of excitatory and inhibitory neurons. The error units that can be also a combination of excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So it will be very difficult to resolve that. But the narrative of the predictive processing framework is very clear about those units in principle. So prediction error matters. Reduction of prediction error or is a currency that might be very useful. And also in the predictive coding framework, you have the resonating, the confirmation signal for a predicted signal that keeps an internal model running. So you have all those components, and I think it's it's going to be. Do you have a suggestion how to resolve that? I mean, or do you have? Is there some variance that is not explained, or that would be more parsimoniously explained by an alternative explanation? I'm not so sure.
Yes.
Okay.
One temporal populating codes, but before we get there, because so I feel one way, if I would be a real cynic and observing your results, I could say, look, you have done a fabulous job dismantling the predictive coding framework. Because the second thing is also, if you go back to the traditional idea of you mentioned Mumford, and then we had a number of other people who had variations on that, and before that also Barlow was talking about it. You would expect that in a cortical circuit, right? It was very literally mapped to the anatomy. That in people would point to certain layers in the cortex that would then deal with the prediction and with the current state and how the error would be computed. So it's all very precisely mapped to cortical circuits, right? But even if you do your layer specific analysis, you don't necessarily see such an asymmetry among the layers in their response. There seems to be a very gradual distribution of the signal that you get in your task. In that case, it was more like an occlusion task, but I think it makes the same point, right? So in that sense, aren't you showing that actually what goes on in these circuits might reflect aspects of prediction, but it's not necessarily playing out in the way as anticipated in these more traditional models? Would you agree with that?
I'm totally experimental and not dogmatic, right? So these are interesting questions. I want to see how does, traditional neuroscience looks at the stimulus response to a unpredicted random stimulus. And of course, in those experiments, you can never see the capability of predicted sequences and so on. So you need to do the experiments in which the stimulus history is predictive for a certain variation and so on. And I think that's what we have done and others, and whether this creates the one point in which I deviate with the Rauer and Ballard model, if you like, is that what we see is that the top-down prediction is creating a signal in where there is nothing, right? So predictive coding is a story in which you explain away as much data as possible, but now we show that in the non-stimulated region where there's nothing to explain away, there's something created, right? There's a model, there's a prediction, created and used energy to put their hypothesis to then be tested. So in this respect, it deviates, and I mentioned Flores de Lange showing similar results for illusory contours. They are created, they are put into a map. It's an active blackboard framework in which the chalk is picked up, and to draw something on the active blackboard and say, it would make sense if there's something moving, and it would make sense if there's some information missing at these and these points. In a global sense, that might be very useful and minimize energy in this sense that it prepares the organism to respond to more or less surprising stimuli. But it's not all about a quick explaining away of all energy in hierarchy, as it was shown by Rauer and Ballard, which is just a very simplified model to illustrate some principles of predictive processing.
Then combining with that, also what you also mentioned much more detailed physiology that you did with Larkham and other people inside the Human Brain Project. And also there, you went over those results rather quickly, but still, at best, they showed there is indeed interaction between higher and lower areas, but there was not necessarily a clean signature of anything we might want to interpret like a strong prediction or an error or anything along these lines, right? It seemed a more non-specific sensory processing that depends on the active dendrite.
Yeah. So, this is ongoing data that is recorded and still analyzed. What I think in the classical V1 ice cube model and following some claims that Jack Gallant would say it's almost explained. 80% of the variance is explained in V1. We have a very good idea of our models about V1, and that is true actually for in certain restrictions. So it is in those models in which you have a strain of surprising stimuli. It doesn't explain ongoing activity, baseline activity, and these kind of things, which are a huge contributor to the energy level that is boiled off in V1 volume. So it's maybe only the waves on top of that are then explained. Now, in a classical receptive field V1 explanation model, you don't have the description of these feedback signals that I described. Another one that I haven't described today, but we have done research, is in blindfolded subjects. When we play auditory scenes, you have some activity in V1 that is related to these auditory scenes. So the properties and the mechanisms in V1 are still, having room for negotiations of expectations and predictions in whatever kind of mechanisms. And I think Christian Liefeld is doing a wonderful job in decoding also the level of interneuronal activity that contributes to the detection and the explaining away. And I think he has found a subtype of inhibitor neurons that is very strong in exactly being silent during visual stimulation and being active during in between stage. So it could be a role of working hard to explain things away that we still will find out. So there are many subunits that can still be contributing to this model and to this compartment of visual cortex that we think we understand best. Maybe V1 is thought to be one of those regions that are best studied and best understood. And yet there are like languages of feedback signals that we don't fully conceptualize.
You mentioned one of the results that you found was a difference between paranoid schizophrenic patients and controls on this apparent motion task. So what do you read from that in terms of support for your hypothesis about top-down predictions, and also what does it tell us about schizophrenia?
So we actually didn't find a difference between schizophrenic subjects and controls, not in the dimension that we expected it, in the predictability effect, because we could confirm the predictability effect. We saw overall a difference in the amount of apparent motion perception, if you like, but so the responses to detection of apparent motion was different in controls and schizophrenia.
I mean, there's a general result, isn't there, that schizophrenics are less susceptible to some visual illusions.
Exactly, yeah, like the hollow face mask illusion, and the same is true for apparent motion. But what we didn't find is that the effect that we see, the advantage of a flickering stimulus that is consistent with an apparent motion context, was more or less in schizophrenic subjects than in control subjects. So the original idea was that it could be that the signatures of creating a prediction error and the processing of a prediction error are altered in schizophrenic subjects. They are less tuned to process the prediction error, or higher tuned. This could actually, they are both hypotheses. But we didn't find that, so we basically just replicated this. Now we are testing the same thing in autistic subjects. We're just starting to do that, same experiment. And some have suggested that it should precisely be the difference between autistic subjects and schizophrenic subjects, in which you have this low-level difference in visual predictability that matters in autistic subjects, but not in schizophrenic. So we will see that. But the prediction here would be that autistic pupils would be less tuned in explaining away the predicted stimulus. It would be as unexplained, as surprising as the unpredicted one. And it shows a tuning for predictability that is important and essential. And we could think of it in the sense that if you experience lucid dreams, it's maybe a situation you're quite aware, you're aware, you're conscious, but you don't respond to prediction errors. The story, you don't wake up and realize you are in your bed, but you continue your dream, and knowing being in your bed and knowing to dream does not bring the dream to an end. And so that's maybe a situation that comes very closely to a auditory hallucination in schizophrenic subject. It is causing some prediction error. They are surprised, they are worried, but it's not resolved. It doesn't make the internal representation go away or being replaced and overwritten by an alternative.
But now, in terms of the actual data, in the schizophrenics, if you would do the parent motion task, how big is the deflection you would see in their mold response as compared to a healthy control? What is the exact difference?
Sorry for having been so brief, but in the talk, I only presented behavioral results, and we haven't done functional brain imaging with them. It's just a behavioral observation that they are not detecting the in-time stimulus as good as the...
But what would be your prediction in with respect to what you would see if you would do fMRI on them?
Yeah, that's a good one, right? In the autistic subjects, if we find behavioral, no difference between the predicted and the non-predicted flash stimulus, we would like to do the fMRI experiment using layer-specific fMRI to see whether then we have a continuous low precision prediction in the superficial layer that doesn't discriminate and doesn't trigger an error signal. Right. Could be one hypothesis. So another one would be that apparent motion is never creating any activity along the trace, so that the envelope is maybe processed feed-forwardly, but there's no feedback message. So everything that comes in hits the clear slate. Mm-hmm.
So now, since I'm on this crusade to sort of demolish the predictive model, another piece of the data that feeds that assault is the data that you presented on the cerebellum, which is really interesting, right? Because when you opened up your analysis and go more whole brain and also look at how other structures would be involved in this, now suddenly the cerebellum starts to also show activity in this task, right? So now I could say, aha, you see, apparently this sort of clean isomorphic mapping of prediction hierarchies to cortex is insufficient to explain the paradigm, to explain the behavioral effect, right? So how does the results you get from the cerebellum not question this predictive hierarchy model that we started out with?
So I had been a cortical chauvinist by accident, not by conviction. So we just started out scanning cortex because and cerebellum didn't make it into our slab. We have changed that now, and I'm at the, I'm still on my learning curve to learn more about the cerebellum. How much I understand of it, or some of the hypotheses are that it is a machinery that has an architecture to create a temporal forward model that is used in, for example, in tracing behavior. So tracing a curve, monkeys can follow this curve by smoothly, which is a visual motor integration task, that by taking away the cerebellum, this movement becomes very jittered and incoherent and so on. And there's a long line of different research, but so the cerebellum in a way is not directly connected to the outside world. It receives cortical input, processes this, and is the archetypical region for an afferents copy processing, which is basically predictive machinery. And so, as I've heard in a recent talk, if evolution came out with a perfect prediction machinery and is connected potentially to the entire brain, what would you use that machinery for? And so I think the conclusion is that lots of the forward modeling that is necessary for survival is offloaded or is done under participation with the cerebellum. So it is, if you like, our predictive machinery that communicates then with the different sensory and motor output areas.
Now, what's also funny about that is with them, the cerebellar projections are mainly going to frontal parts of the cortex, most densely. So, so then to get that signal back into V1, we can take some cascade of recurrent projections. Right?
I thought so that there are some I think there are some direct connections to visual. So there's some visual cerebellum connections. I'm not entirely sure if they go to V1 or to extrastriate areas and so on. But I think there must be something like a visual subpart of cerebellum.
Sure. But okay, so the last part of your talk went a little bit more in the direction of also a more computational understanding what this whole system might be doing, right? So the bottom line would be cortex builds hierarchies of internal models that are coupled through prediction errors, right? And so that was the starting point, and that's been a great heuristic for you to perform some really fantastic experiments that also led to new insights. But new insights might also allow us to reformulate the model, right? So if you would have to sort of crystallize that current view, what would be your current summary of the model or the theory of neocortex? How should we think about neocortex given the data that you have in your hands?
I think that, of course, one of the big struggles is to find the right level of abstraction in answering your question in the description, right? How many units do we need? What kind of abstraction is useful for what kind of understanding? We still don't. Neuroscience is a data-rich science with relatively little theories. At least that's what some of the criticism says about neuroscience. So, and we haven't. This is a question we haven't fully resolved. Which level of description do we need? Do we need spiking neurons explanation? Do we need principles? And I think this predictive processing has some hypothesis, some units, which could be in single neurons or microcircuits, which is the description of prediction errors, for example, important currency, I think, and also the kind of population code of internal models. So for more complex human tasks, it is extremely important to be able to simulate an counterfactual situation, to plan behavior, to plan interaction, or to plan a career. We can think about. I mean, there are many very fascinating how can you explain that a biological system is capable of committing suicide? How did evolution make it possible that you can you create an internal model that is somehow rewarding, that you simulate and say that makes sense, and then commit suicide, which in biology is extremely unbiological, right? So there is only a few components that you need to be able to explain how internal models can create a good description about external facts, right? So deep encoding works well in the visual system, for example, to now label visual scenes and learn the different objects by coming up with a condensed description, but just by learning an incredible amount of visual stimuli and trying to extract the most essential features. So I think there are some of those components that are sufficient to come up with a hierarchy of extracted features by using prediction error minimization. But I think what's unresolved so far, what I want to look into future, if that was your question, is the kind of how do you lift up this internal models that are then totally connected and well describing the environment to something that is alternative, that you can plan alternative to the currently existing outside world.
I was looking for an alternative to the classical model. I don't really hear it yet, but Tony.
Well, you mentioned the deep convolution neural nets a couple of times in your talk and just now. And, sort of Paul and I are both interested in putting models of the brain into robots and getting to do tasks in real time. So, and I take from some of the things you're saying that maybe there's some useful mileage to be had in using these convolution neural networks as an approximation to what the visual pathways might be doing. But I mean, say we get that working in some sort of first pass, what would be the things that we would be missing out on, and what would we want to add to make this a more realistic model?
So I think the flexibility, the adaptation to new environments is something that is a potential of expanding deep encoding neuronal networks that are feed-forward networks by expanding to recurrent looping might be able to make them even more clever. To, let's say, the context-dependent amplification and de-amplification is something that could potentially, once we find the right architecture, make deep encoding networks more flexible to adapt to new environments. So this is, I mean, you're more the experts in this, and I'm sure this is something that's widely debated. From our research, we just see the great difference between the big success story of deep encoding networks, convolutional networks, that are very similar to the hierarchy in the visual system. However, they're both feed-forward. So they're feed-forward processing architecture. And the only thing that's fed back is the error signal. But in a if we take our research serious and add a feedback cascading network to the feed-forward, then what we get, for example, is a network that can fill in occluded images, which is one of the examples that we have used in our lab, in which we see that humans kind of have line drawings fitted in by their visual cortex, and our deep encoding networks connected to an autoencoder, so a U-shaped network, is able to then make predictions about occluded objects or images that are currently not in sight. And so that could be an architecture that is also, that is if you like, an active blackboard of predictions, what is happening when something disappears or over time, and makes a world, enriches, so to say, the environment in which the network is working.
But wouldn't that imply that we would need much more brain volume with our skull in the size of a skipping ball? Because in that, for those models, if you want to bring in now any kind of invariance, scale, rotation, position, you have to duplicate your wires, right? So you would run out of wires very quickly. So would it scale? Would that approach really scale, you think?
I mean, on what we have done for the U-shaped network is just doubling the network, right? It's a so after the conversion, it diverges and has lateral connections, and to reconstruct the images, and that makes it to an if you like, an active blackboard architecture. Nico has done it in a slightly different way, used object recognition task in a network that is either feed forward or has also lateral and feedback connections, this BLT network, and could show that this kind of network architecture is better in recognizing overlaid numbers, cluttered scenes, and so on. And that architecture came from kind of joint discussions we had about, the question, how would you add, what would feedback add to your feed-forward networks? How could it improve that? How could we design experiments that challenge the current recognition system? And so cluttered scenes and overlaps was one of those examples that he tried. And I think, the AlexNet kind of architecture would had something like 88% correct or more, or 95% correct classification. And then his BLT, bottom up, lateral, and top down network was a few percentage better, or part of percentage or something, significantly. So it's small, but you need to find new tasks and new challenges that those networks can play out in maybe their potential, because they're already in object recognition. That seems to be a field where they are ceiling now. But so coming back to the point, it might be that they are now more flexible. Maybe there are advantages in training rates or something. I don't know. I'm not the expert.
So we need to add in these sort of top-down cascades, and we can get some improvement.
Yeah.
And presumably some sharpening of the representations in V1. And I think one of the times you said in your talk, you usually think of V1 as the bottom of the hierarchy, but in a sense, it's much higher up because the information ascends and comes back down. So you're reconstructing this high-resolution version of the scene. But I mean, you also talked about how we can apply machine learning algorithms or support vector machines to read out from the brain to what the brain is actually seeing. So it seems to me that in some ways we're getting back to what really was an old idea about the visual system, that the brain or the visual brain represents its best guess at what's in the world in some, almost literal sense. The whole idea of the movie screen in the head, which, was, sort of dismissed by everybody as naive. But with these kind of approaches, with this notion that you're getting this high resolution map, which is tuned by your predictions, that there is in some sense something like a representation in V1 of your best guess of the high resolution scene as we know it?
It's an interesting question, right? It's something, it does make sense. It's intuitive, and in another sense, it seems a bit homunculus. It seems like the screen that, as you said, you can laugh about.
But you opened that door by talking about lighter.
I did. But this is totally empirical.
I start with it.
I know. So I think, yes, V1 now looks to us as if you have kind of mental line drawings put together in V1, and maybe that is a bit the language of V1. And I mean, it's an incredible story. I think if you look back, Peter, Patrick Kavanagh talks about this 10,000 years of neuroscience by describing the if you look at the line drawings in caves, that is a form of communication that works, and that's surprising because line drawings work even though line drawings don't exist in the world, right? What we see is or what's out there are textures and texture borders, but from a texture border to come to a line drawing is an abstraction that seems to work incredibly good for our visual system. And since we were totally surprised that if we asked the subjects to fill in the missing information, they come up with the same line drawing. And maybe there's a clue because we find a communication that works. It's so error proven. So if you try to do a line drawing of an animal and you're not happy with it, you optimize it until you're happy, and you think this is a good illustration of an deer or so, and then you present that to someone else, and the value, the quality, and the goodness of fit to their internal model is so immediate because we have the same kind of visual system. And that opens up a communication. If we would open up this kind of communication with monkeys, if they could start drawing out their internal models,
That's interesting, right? This is a speculation we could have had in the 60s by saying, the language of V1 are contrast boundary contours, right? So in some sense, what's interesting about this, as opposed to having sort of complex predictive hierarchy, maybe you need the majority of machinery of vision just sits in V1. And what these higher areas are doing is basically, if you want to, in a very coarse way, modulating this process in V1. So the whole hierarchy is now collapsing into V1 essentially. And all the rest does is say, well, let's ignore these bits, right? Or, okay, let's attend more to that part without telling it precisely what it should be seeing. Maybe that's sort of the mistake people make.
What about...
the predictive model is therefore maybe not telling you exactly you should see this texture in this position. It may be the prediction just tells you, look, there's something interesting there. Check it out, right?
Yeah.
You buy that?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, what are we also experts in is face processing, right? So if you can
face with PH or
face with the emotion. We can read out the emotion and the gender out of faces, and we can see kinship relations and all these kind of incredible tasks in faces. Now, if you imagine the face of persons that you know very well, your line drawings aren't very precise, and it needs a lot of training to be good at that, to do the happy face of your wife or so from this. But we have done an experiment in which we see that the encoding of emotions and gender discrimination makes differences in V1. So whether you have the task to recognize a gender or to recognize the emotional expression, we mapped out retotopic spaces around mouth and eyes, but you can see a feedback signal in the other parts that are still having a signature, whether it is happy or fearful and so on. So this, I think, doesn't speak to a feedback signal that is very precise, let's say like a line drawing of a precise emotion of a face, but it's like a marker, that a token that says, here's a face, should be happy, very well your daughter, and that is a prediction. Now, that is a good template if then the stimulus comes up and there's a change in the facial expression. You have FFA and other the face network to work out the differences between your prediction and the actual input. But the token, the marking of where something is expected, is negotiated with higher and early visual areas. So I think the idea that I triggered of a cave drawing, in a way, V1 is something like an active blackboard, which works like line drawings and tokens. Maybe tokens adjusted to that, where you say, oh, bad animal, and here is a face of something.
By this token, this
Well,
is how we protect on V1.
Well,
No, not the content. More like we open up a channel that we speak to each other. So you need to be a channel of high spatial frequencies because you're now interested in the emotion around the mouth. And that is interesting in this part of V1. V1 doesn't know anything about those faces, but yeah, the token is in the communication and higher.
Got it. No, I thought you put a token also inside V1, so that sounded confusing to me. Not like this, I get it absolutely.
Yeah,
that makes sense because then we have very parsimonious linking, but then it's not necessarily defined along this notion of hierarchies of forward models, right? It's a rather different kind of framework we're then in.
Well, we're talking about the generative capacity of the brain now, and how that can, be a tool for thought. Whether your imagination and dreaming, all of these processes where there's no visual input, you can reconstruct activity throughout the visual hierarchy, and including in V1. If you want to think about the details of, say, a line drawing, you can imagine that, and that might require or involve activity in V1, which then sets off cascades of activity elsewhere in the brain. So we don't have to invoke a homunculus to see why it's worth reconstructing the visual scene at the V1 level.
Look, I appreciate that you're speaking up for Lars now.
No, I'm not. This is very much my own idea about what we might, why V1 might operate in this way.
Look, and I agree with this. I don't have a problem with that.
Okay.
My remark with the criticism was a bit different. Like, we started with a rather explicitly defined notion of prediction hierarchies, which are all sort of convergent to something like a Kalman filter. It's very explicitly defined, and it really dictates to you what should happen in these cascades of interactions. And what I think we've seen at the end of the discussion, that there are cascades of interaction, but they might not follow this very restricted view on hierarchies of predictive filters.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We might have to open up that perspective more, like how Lars now describes the idea of having a higher level area that's a very abstract token type representation of something, and it seeks information in preceding areas, is not necessarily following this idea of prediction hierarchies. Maybe it just looks for confirmation, doesn't give a damn about errors, right? And that's how you can hallucinate things, because you don't care about errors. You just care about confirmation of whatever stuff you believe in higher areas. So that was more my challenge. And maybe the data and discussion is leading us to the point where we should open up the perspective. These are not just strictly defined prediction hierarchies. There's not enough data to support that. And maybe this model of token representations are maybe an alternative that is richer and maybe also closer to data. That was basically what I was saying. So are you happy with that, Tony? Or you think I'm sort of misconstruing the discourse now?
Well, I think you're pushing
which I happily do most of the time.
You're very much pushing it in a certain direction, which I don't think Lars was necessarily
But he was
agree
nodding
with.
his head. Maybe he's just tired.
I think that's probably the case, and he has a plane to catch. You've ground him down.
Good. You see? Endurance wins the day again. So Lars, now before you can escape, there's two last hurdles you have to take. The first one is, so this is not easy territory. It's really involved experimental methods. It links to theory. It's very precise. It's hard work, right? This stuff doesn't come for free. So I'm sure you have plenty of scars being in this domain. So if we would like to follow your route to try to understand the brain, what is Lars' law? What is Lars' law that we should follow to understand the brain?
Okay, so of course there is a kind of learning of the tools that we try to sharpen and to get better, to explore. So what we bring to the table, what every neuroscience labs brings to the table, or different background, is expertise with the tools and making them sharper, being able to explore more and more cutting edge. For example, we do the ultra high resolution to layer specific fMRI, and using these techniques of brain reading for non-stimulated areas. This is something that we learned over time that it's possible, and there's a lot of methodological kind of question. Now, once you have this kind of tool set that you think is very good to explore with vector topic mapping and individual subject analysis and all of this, then it's important to find relevant questions and explain them in such terminology that your corner field becomes bigger and wider, and you find more and more overlap with other labs and.
House is a law. We have to be able to put it on a.
I don't know what you mean by law. I kind of understood what's my method.
The law of effect, right? For instance.
Well,
or the law of how to do science.
I'm talking more about how to do science. I think there's a lot that we start to learn by doing multidisciplinary, multi-scale, multi-method science, which is a very difficult thing to do because everyone is leaving a little bit of their comfort zone and a little bit of terminology that is very well and precisely defined to open up to other fields in which different terminology is applied and different problems. But by leaving a little bit this comfort zone, the more we do that, the more we find overlap, the bigger questions we can tackle. It's something that certainly we have all experienced in the Human Brain Project, where we come together and start discussing our different approaches, at which you see incredible work, but it is when the incredible works of different labs come together and find common language that you trigger an enormous amount of synergy. And that's something that's very hard work, and it's very difficult and not so comfortable, and it's something very, very important in science. I mean, I'm sometimes surprised when you, for whatever reason, step outside of your field and experience some other science, be it during a review process, during a conference. So usually a conference you wouldn't usually go to, and you realize how fragmented science is. And so it is important to converge, to find bigger stories, to not fight only the corner to sharpen your methods, but also to step outside and get the bigger picture, how it converges and how it fits together. And there's a lot of synergy for many parts of science where I find it extremely exciting.
Mm-hmm. There's a bit in the trend of Ortega y Gasset, right, who spoke of counteracting the barbarism of specialization. So somebody also saying, look, don't get sucked into the specialization, keep an open mind, right? Look at the other surrounding domains.
Yes, that's part of it. I'm also, a fan of using your methods very precisely. I think in brain imaging has been a bit scarred by rapid exploitation of stories, and sometimes it has a bad image. People, have seen and believed images because they were on the brain and they looked so scientifically, and the stories connected to those were not always linked to very hard and precise science. And so I think it's very important to gain back some trust there. And, I think we push the limits and there's a lot in our lab. It's a lot of work. And I think others are doing this in their field as well. But then there's a lot of reward by opening up a little bit and seeing these discussions over dinner and lunchtime when everyone is suddenly starting to discuss other things outside of their scientific expertise. There's a lot of, as I said, synergy and new ideas and converging ideas, I think.
Right. Especially now, the fMRI might reflect activity of astrocytes instead of nerve. But then the last question is, the last time that Tony bought me a beer, or paid for a beer, it's a long time ago. And this has to do with the fact that he lived actually in Edinburgh for a long time. So we have been virtually neighbors, right? You be in Glasgow. So,
not sure we overlap.
But for that reason, Tony will come visit you in 4 years in Glasgow, assuming you're still there, and I'm sure you will be doing great work. And he's going to just come with a notebook to check whether you have confirmed or falsified a specific hypothesis that you're going to share with us today. So what's the hypothesis, the most critical hypothesis in your research program that you want to see tested in this 4-year time frame?
From now on in 4 years, what I want to see tested.
So we're going to have a shifting time window from now, 4 years.
I'm not going to give away my best ideas.
You have your prediction. Okay.
What will happen in my field or in other fields? I think we'll see a lot of.
No, he's coming to your lab to check a specific prediction.
Oh, Tony is going to come.
So you're going to say,
and you will come as well, and you will see that you'll get
no beer.
You get more than a beer. We are very generous in Glasgow. We're not like Edinburgh.
Hypothesis to test, right? We're not that stingy. It's advertised.
No.
So what's the hypothesis?
You're up for a prediction error there.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I don't have a good prediction in this. I mean, what I'm most intrigued, I think, maybe 4 years is not going to be enough, but I want to see the double coding of internal models that are about current situations. They are predictive about the scene, and the mental models about something else being simultaneously processed in our brains, which we know. And we know in which areas, more or less, but we don't know how these codes coexist without interfering with one another. Now, having layer resolution fMRI, I believe we might be able to find different codes simultaneously in these different areas, in the different layers. And I have to disagree with the remark that you made earlier that the differences in the layers, there aren't differences in the layers. I think there are.
I said that it's more gradual. There's more gradual shift. It's not as discrete as these models would have.
Yeah. So we have some new data in which we have visual illusions that are explained away, like motion-induced blindness, which you see a different code is still there, but it's not conscious. So there's more to come from this. But the double coding of mental imagery and visual predictions, I think, is something that I'm interested in. It must come at some level. We might find some ways in which we can see these double codes, some for the internal models that are currently happening, and then other ones that are counterfactual. And it's something that maybe human fMRI or human research is particularly well tuned to, because these kind of experiments are relatively difficult to do in animals. You would need to instruct them to do a visual process and simultaneously do a mental imagery task. It's not totally impossible, but that's something I think I want to have more knowledge about. How do you have these two codes simultaneously?
Right. There'll be a long discussion over a lot of beers. Lars Muckli, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.